delighted today to welcome two guests to this conversation series. Makoto Fujimura is an artist, a writer, and a speaker who's recognized worldwide as a cultural influencer by both faith-based and secular media. He was a presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts, and he founded the International Arts Movement in 1992. Bruce Herman holds the Lothlorien Distinguished Chair in Fine Arts at Gordon College, where he has taught and curated exhibitions since 1984. Herman lectures widely and has been published most recently in Through Your Eyes, published by Erdmans. His artwork has been exhibited in more than 25 solo shows and over 125 group exhibitions in 11 major cities. The two of them have collaborated with composer Christopher Theofanidis, I hope I pronounced that correctly, yeah, on the new touring exhibit 4 Quartets based on Eliot's great work of that name. And its last U.S. stop before being exhibited in Paris is here at Cairn University. And this is the occasion for our conversation today. So welcome to both of you. So I want to start, Mako, with you. And I wonder if you could start at the beginning and just answer this question. Why 4 Quartets? What was it about that work of Eliot's that provided so much inspiration for this project?
Yeah, it was a lot of influences, but one in particular, Greg Wolf, who founded the Image Journal, which is a wonderful journal, comes out from Seattle area. He is a friend of ours, and he lectured for International Arts Movement in the 90s about 4 Quartets in particular, and he said, if you ever feel disoriented, lost, you're not quite sure where you are in life, read 4 Quartets. He had found his faith through this poem, apparently, wrestling with things that Eliot was writing about. And I didn't remember the rest of the lecture until after 9/11. I found myself lost and disoriented. I remembered his words, so I emailed him and asked him to guide me through this poem. It's not a long poem, but it's very dense and difficult to get into if you do not know poetry. So I just asked him to guide me through it, and he wrote me this long email, almost like a PhD dissertation, entry into a PhD dissertation kind of an email, you know, where he listed all these books to read, and you have to read Dante because Eliot read Dante, and you have to read Virgil because Dante read Virgil, and it just, the list just expanded from that. But then, you know, I got to know Bruce in the 90s as well, and as we discovered, we had a similar experience with this poem.
Yeah, well, this morning, Mako was talking about his experience with the tragedy at 9/11 and Ground Zero, and how that connected him in a deeper way with the text. In my case, in 1997, fall of 1997, actually September 12th, 1997, which I'll never forget, our house was struck by lightning and burned to the ground, and my studio with it. So most of my artwork was consumed in the fire.
So this is 40 years of...
Yeah, well, it's more like, 20, 30 years worth of my work. Yeah. That all of my grad school work, all the work I'd done in the 80s was consumed. Some of the work I'd done in the 90s. The only work that survived the fire was a group of paintings I'd done about the subject of Good Friday, the suffering of Christ on Good Friday. And the only reason they survived is because I had just brought them out the day before to show a collector who wanted to acquire one of the pieces. And they were in a part of the house that was separated from the main fire. And the firemen used that as an entry point. Mm-hmm. And they saw the paintings, and they immediately brought the paintings out before they did anything. And I actually came down around the side of the house. I don't know if I told you this. Came down around the side of the house and said, "Don't risk your lives over my artwork." They said, "Oh, don't worry, we got it under control." Mm-hmm. They brought all the artwork out, and those paintings were outside the house while they're trying to put the fire out. What I don't know if I've ever told you this, Mako, but the summer, that previous to that September fire, I had been studying, the text I'd been studying was 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's where Paul talks about our work being tested by fire. So the way I tell the story now is my work was tested and found wanting.
Yeah, so be careful what you read. You were reading Eliot and 1 Corinthians 3.
The way Eliot works into this is our pastor, who is a Bible scholar by the name of Gordon Hugenberger, who's now senior minister at Park Street Church in Boston. Gordon drove up the driveway the following day in the smoldering hulk of the house, and he got out of his car, and I happened to be there, just standing there, still sort of puzzled and bewildered by what had just happened. He got out of his car and he walked up to me, and instead of quoting scripture, the first words out of his mouth were, redeemed from fire, by fire, which is out of Eliot, not out of 1 Corinthians, although Eliot bases that on 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So there's this funny labyrinth of texts that sort of surround that event for me. But I've been reading Eliot, I've been reading the 4 Quartets since I was 19 years old.
Okay, that's interesting. So you had been reading it for some time.
I had been reading it at that point for 30 years.
Okay. So for both of you, this is sort of a long-term rumination process on Eliot that's expressed
It's
in
an uber text.
Yeah.
It's a text that you can go back to again and again, and it begins to read you.
Right, and initially you don't understand it in a way, and it seems obscure language, but as you live with it, it opens itself up to our experience, and no matter what you're going through. Yeah.
In fact, I'll just recite one little passage there that relates to what we're talking about. This is a familiar passage. You may have heard it before. It's from the last of the 4 sections of the poem. Towards the very end of the poem, the dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare, the one discharged from sin or error is the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. He's writing this as the bombs are falling in London. So the dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one. I mean, he's basically describing what he was seeing. But he's connecting it with the dove of the Holy Spirit, and also the redemptive fire. And the choice of pyre or pyre, you can choose to go through the fire that burns you and destroys you, or you can choose to go through the fire that refines you and brings out what is pure, what is good. And that's, of course, the text from Paul, from 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So.
And it does have those underpinnings of Dante and
Oratorio. Yeah, it does. The way up is down.
Yeah.
And when I first heard of Bruce was at a conference, and this, I think he might have been Cam, who stood up, now the executive director of SIVA, Christians and Visual Arts, and this was a conference. And I was new back in the States, and I attended this conference, didn't know Bruce, and this person said, we got to pray for Bruce, he lost everything. And I imagine myself in that position, my studio burnt down, lost 20, 30 years of work. How I would handle it, and I couldn't really grasp how I would do that. And so I think it was 2 years later that I met you, and I went up and introduced myself. I said, I've been praying for you. I'm so sorry for your loss. And he had this grin that Bruce is known for. He said, oh, thanks for your prayers. That was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And I was like, you're either crazy or you're somebody I need to get to know. And so at that point, our friendship grew, and come to discover that Eliot, 4 Quartets had this connection point for both of us. But you talk about the poem guiding you through.
Well, the thing, like you said this morning so beautifully in your chapel address, there's companionship with an artist, a poet, a composer who you can connect with because they can move you through the darkness or through the pain or the grief or the loss. and not give you some pablum, some ready-made answer that is supposed to fix things, but instead brings you into the crucible of what I can only think of as true virtue, which is surrender. At some point, you have to give in to the pain. You have to give in to the grief, give in to the suffering. And this is, Christ on the cross is a supreme moment where he says, it's finished. Father, unto thee I surrender my spirit. Mm-hmm. So there's this giving in, and I think in the arts, uniquely, there's a way of moving us through the period we're all going to go through. Many of us will go through it many times in our lives. Terrible loss. We're going to go through the loss of our own life at some point. And to always be dodging that or always sidestepping that is what creates all kinds of tension in our lives and creates a lot of mental and emotional illness. But I think in the case of Eliot, he was, in this poem, he's bringing us face to face with our own mortality, his own mortality, and yet helping us to move through it with integrity, with honesty, and yet creating beauty in a time of terror. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is really the thing. This is why I think Chris Theofanidis, I wish he was here, the composer who wrote music for our project, this piece that he has written at the still point, I hope you get to hear it performed someday. You'll be able to listen to it in recorded form, mm-hmm. but I hope you get to hear it performed because it's the kind of music, and I think you're the one that first said this, Mako, it's the kind of music that can be written in a time of loss. It can be heard and listened to and lived in through a time of loss, and yet it's not wallowing in that time of loss, mm-hmm. but moving us through it again. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. So Chris Theofanidis is...
Theofanidis.
Thank you again.
Yes.
I'm sorry. His composition
Yes.
deals with a particular line in four quartets, a particular section.
Each of the four movements.
Yeah. Now, were you thinking in those terms as you painted? And I would ask that question of each of you, or was it more the whole of the work?
Right. It's a whole project, and not so much specific. We kind of create connections to a particular area. In my case, my paintings are particularly connected to East Coker passages of this darkness. But I was also thinking about Bruce's work. And, collaboration is a way for us to serve each other, and how my art can serve Bruce's work. And so I wanted to create this dimensionless space where Bruce was particularly creating spatial exploration with figures and recognizable imagery. So I pushed myself to the minimal, to almost non-existent mm-hmm. realm, but I wanted the darkness itself to have light. So I developed this gesso with my assistant Lindsay So when you stand in these paintings, your eye will first say, oh, this is a black painting. Mm-hmm. But as you stand and look at it, let your eye adjust, you will start to see the light inside the background. And so in that sense, it's throughout the poem. Mm-hmm. As Chris's music is also composed brilliantly, I think, in if you study music theory, you have all these touch points on how music is created, but what he does is create really a still point with disjointed elements that almost falls apart in the score. Musicians playing this, I've spoken to them, and they said this is one of the most difficult things they ever played, because it can fall apart if you're not good.
The way that to answer your question more directly, Chris has styled each one of the four movements to a particular textual reference.
Right.
But like Mako and like me, he's also interacting with the entire gestalt, the entire pattern of the poem, in a way. To take one line and try to illustrate it would defeat the whole purpose of this project. Because we weren't trying to illustrate the poem. What we're trying to do is interact with the very same realities that Eliot was interacting with, only in our case in visual form, and in Chris's case musical form, and then interacting with each other's work. I I mean, Chris came up and visited my studio when the paintings were in process. He and I went down to visit Mako's studio when they were in process.
Right.
And then he came back a second time, and all three of us got together at my place when we first heard drafts of Chris's music on our piano at our house. That was an amazing day.
That was, and
so
it was
while the
yeah.
project was ongoing, you were all
Yes,
three
all
interacting.
three of, we didn't know Chris that well, and got to know him through this project, and what a joy it has been. As Bruce mentioned, you know, three of us began to intuit each other's work, and almost release each other to a certain place that we'd never been, you know, creatively, push each other in that sense. So what we ended up creating individually has been probably our best work, and probably has become the foundation for, you know, the next phase of our work. And I don't think we could have done that apart from three of us willing to, in a sense, die to ourselves, submit to the text, to honor the text, but also to support each other as artists. You know, artists so much about your ego and, you know, self-expression, and this project was a complete counterpoint to a kind of an antidote, we hope, to that. That if we learn to submit to each other, to the text first, and by the way, this reality of submitting to a text, like for Quartets, Eliot's written artifact, three living artists doing this. Ted Libby, the music critic, the NPR guy, said probably has never been done before. I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly is an anomaly in a world in which everything is a self-promotion. We were trying to find that still point by doing the opposite, you know, to push ourselves to serve each other. And as a result, we found expression that I don't think we'll ever, you know,
I mean, I
have
can
reached.
say, I was so surprised when I saw when the first time I went down and saw the works in progress for this project, I was so surprised because I associate, as most people do who are familiar with Mako's work, I associate your work with expressive color and many layers of transparency or opacity, and kind of a gentle organic movement from one place in the composition to another. And those are the things, the hallmarks of your work through the Nihonga tradition, and also, you know, the way you've interacted both with the tradition and the contemporary. But these paintings are all about absence and emptiness and this kind of background hum, almost the same feel as those deep field photographs of the Hubble telescope, where you just see endless expanse of interstellar space. I had the feeling that your work was completely empty, and I was a bit shocked when I first saw it. But then when I got back to the studio and began working again, partly in response, and going back to the text and listening to the drafts of Chris's music, I realized, yeah, it had to be that way. For me to do what I was doing, and for Chris to do what he was doing, there was this kind of real, organic, I don't know what the right word is, but we say collaboration, but I almost feel we were just three vessels of something much larger than ourselves. And you definitely get that feeling with Eliot, that he's serving this colossal thing, which is this work, which dwarfs him as an individual poet, because he's really serving the whole tradition and building a bridge to the possibility of a future. It's generative. He isn't just honoring the past. He's not a traditionalist poet, but he knows the tradition deeply, deeply, in a way that traditionalists often miss.
Yeah, and he seems to have an appeal that even people who don't normally embrace modernism seem to like Eliot, which is sort of an interesting thing. Yeah. But so it sounds to me as if what you're saying is that the act of working together, almost the discipline of working together and off one another, actually created something really deep and powerful. Yeah, yeah. So you would say the same thing, Bruce?
Absolutely. I'm not a very good judge of my own work. I don't think any of us really is. My best critic is my wife, Meg. She's merciless, too. And also full of mercy at the same time. Merciless in the right way. But she came down to the studio at one point to look at the paintings, and she would point out things that were weak or needed strengthening. But at one point she stopped and she said, "This is the best work you've ever done. I hope you realize this." And it's funny looking at your paintings, Mark. I was so surprised when I saw them, but I think not only are the best work you've done, but the work that has come since is really your best work. It almost feels like this project is this sort of fruitful, kind of fertile space, blackness, emptiness, out of which something really new and fresh can come. And I feel the same way. Chris Theofanidis is just about to, I think he's just debuted a new opera that he's written. And so we're going forward. This isn't about, Eliot says in Dry Selvages, the third part of the poem, he says, not farewell, fare forward, O voyager.
Did you expect that when you started? I mean, so you thought this was something that was an intriguing idea that had brought a lot to both of your lives, but did you expect that?
We should tell the story of how we got this started at the dinner party.
Well, all of this started because of Walter and Arlene Hansen, who stepped behind this conversation, and we were having dinner with him, and was Miroslav Wolf was there. He, the theologian, friend of ours, and we were just talking about this and that, and we just stumbled upon Eliot, and Walter started to quote Foucault. I mean, he had memorized the poem, and so we're like, whoa, you know this poem that well, and he said, absolutely, and so he said, after we shared about this possibility of a collaboration, he said, what are you waiting for, and he basically helped us to get it started, and so I did not expect any of this to become such a generative force in my life. We were thinking about I was thinking about several things. One, I wanted to honor my father, who research scientist, who has in so many ways helped me to be an artist that I am today. And he's 87, and and so I began to talk to, maybe I don't know if I talked to you about it, but I began to think of a way of creating an institute called Fujimura Institute, which was a way for me to archive my work and my writings and, apprentice program and so forth, that we might partner with Cairn on some level. But to bring that into the full picture, this would be the first project. So that's what I said to Walter, was this would be a perfect project for Fujimura Institute. And
we all agree that this was a great idea.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not have this be the first project for
Right.
Fujimura
Then you met my father.
I met his dad. We had breakfast, and I turned to Mako. I said, "Do you think your dad would let me paint him for this project?" And so he said, "Well, let me talk to him." And of course, his dad was probably
very delighted,
a bit flattered, but said yes. And so he's the model for my
winter
I
piece.
heard about that. Okay.
Yes, that's my father.
And Mako, I don't know that I've ever told you this, but the thing that got me started on these 4 paintings for the 4 quartets was the portrait I did of my dad.
I do remember you saying that.
So
it made sense.
I just made the connection that we were both motivated to honor our father. In my case, both my father and my mother, because I did a portrait of each of them. My dad and mom had just died. They died within 2 months of each other, like about 10 months before we had this conversation. And I had done these portraits, one of my dad, one of my mother, and those paintings were kind of the fertile launch point for me, for these paintings. And it was such an honor for me to be able to paint your dad as part of this, because, again, honoring your desire to honor your dad.
Yeah, it seems as if the thread that keeps running through all of this is that you're sort of thinking in terms of honoring this work and other elements of your past, and yet it's opening up these new vistas for the future.
And that's what Eliot and my father would want, is this is not about, ultimately not about them, but then it's not about us. It's about passing it on to the next generation of artists and poets, who can see that there is a lineage and tradition that can renew itself in their work. That it's a generative journey. It's not this narrowing down, but it's opening up into hopefully a new renaissance, new kind of something that is a new path toward creating culture that serves each other and the world.
There's a great passage in an essay by a German philosopher. I don't know if you've ever heard of Gadamer. It's called The Relevance of the Beautiful. It's an amazing essay, but in the middle of it, Gadamer says this amazing thing. He said, tradition is not so much about conservation as it is about transmission. And every act of transmission is also necessarily an act of translation. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you can't just simply reproduce the past. You can't simply, if you want to really honor tradition, you can't be a traditionalist. Mm-hmm. Because you have to translate it into the contemporary moment that you're living, with the possibility that it might be read by someone. I mean, Eliot has no idea if his poem's going to be read 500 years from now, like he was reading Dante. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure he had a hope that he could make something that would be fruitful for future generations. That's certainly our hope, is we can make something that's going to last. Not to honor ourselves, but to honor the tradition and the source of that tradition, which is Christ, the still point of the turning world, as Eliot puts it.
Now, does that happen at a conscious level? I mean, are you thinking as you're painting and planning painting, you're saying, okay, these elements of the I mean, how does that, explain how that works exactly, or is there no way to explain it?
I think the best any of us can do is to be willing to be servants of the work. And that's a phrase I get from Dorothy Sayers, who was part of the C.S. Lewis and Tolkien friendship group. This isn't about feeling inspired to make great art, and it isn't even about expressing yourself so much. I mean, self-expression is inevitable. You can't help it. It's like the way you walk or breathe, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to happen. But this idea of being a servant of, the word is kenosis, I'm thinking from Philippians, where it says, though he existed in the form of God, thought it not something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondslave. The kenosis, the self-emptying. I think ultimately that's all we can do, is give ourselves away in the work and let the chips fall where they may. You can't predict what's going to happen next. You don't know whether some future generation is going to care about anything you've done.
Right.
And yet you do it in a way that somehow you're convinced that it's going to last. And if you don't have that, you're not going to be, you're not going to paint. Emily Dickinson had no audience, but yet she knew that her poems would be read 100 years later, or maybe even more. It takes a kind of tenacity to do that, and faith, I think. So in a sense, every artist is working within the faith framework. Artists have to have faith to create, because they believe in the future. They believe that their work is going to be seen by somebody or read by somebody. And without that audience possibility, at least, you cannot work. So it's this funny paradox. You have to learn to find yourself under this weight of your calling, and you learn to stand under that reality, and so that means to prepare yourself as much as you can to this craft of whatever you're doing, to be best at it, but at the same time having the humility to die to yourself, leave the room, and so that the real work can begin, and let this integration happen. And so much of what we've done with Quartets, the work, is being realized later when we do these exhibits. And everywhere we go, we find that there is a different incarnation of what we've done, and the work that the audience has, taught us, really. And for Eliot, too, we have to remember, this is his last poem. And he lived much longer. So it was an intentional choice for him to say, this is my last work, this is the work that I'm going to be remembered for that he desired that. And to say that, audaciously, that this work is going to stand the test of time.
Bruce Herman, Mako Fujimura, thank you very much
Thank you.
for this interview.
Thank you.
Thank you.